This is the Illimitable Experience podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Illimitable Experience podcast. If you're watching this video, like this video, and if you haven't subscribed to the channel, do subscribe to the channel. We are posting great content regularly. With that, today we have as our guest, Professor Carl. Hello, Professor Carl. How are you?
Hello, Manan. Thank you for inviting me. I'm well, and how are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. So, Professor Carl, can you just introduce yourself, who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my name is Professor Carl Chinn MBE. I'm a social historian. I live in Birmingham. I was born in Birmingham, and my focus of my studies for many years has been about the urban working class, particularly in Birmingham and the surrounding districts. But over the last few years, my writings have really concentrated on the real Peaky Blinders and the real gangs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right. Professor, can you explain what is the MBE that is followed by your name?
Right, the MBE is a medal I was awarded from the Queen. It means a member of the British Empire, and it was awarded to me after many people supported the fact that I should be recognised for my support for local history and my work for charities.
Wow, that's fantastic. Now, Professor Carl, you said that you have been writing on the Peaky Blinders since the past few years. So what really intrigued you to write on this topic?
Well, I first wrote about the real Peaky Blinders in my doctoral thesis back in the mid-1980s. I'd heard about the Peaky Blinders growing up. I'm 66. I've got a mother from Aston. My dad was from Sparkbrook, which are both older areas of Birmingham, very tough working class neighbourhoods. And so I'd heard about the Peaky Blinders growing up, but like others of my age, all we really knew was the myth about the disposable safety razor blades in the peak of their flat caps. But when I was writing my doctoral thesis, it was about Sparkbrook. I wanted to have a chapter at the start looking at the context of Birmingham in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And whilst Birmingham was praised as the best governed city in the world and as the city of 1,000 trades, what none of the history books said was it was also one of the most violent cities in England and the city of the Peaky Blinders. So I did research on the Peaky Blinders back then. Then in 1987, I was researching a book on the history of illegal betting and bookmaking. My family had been bookmakers, illegal bookmakers, taking bets on horse racing in the back streets of Sparkbrook from the 1920s. Cash betting away from the racecourse was against the law until 1961. So my family had been illegal. And I was writing a book about that, but I also wanted to find out about bookmaking on the racecourse. A bookmaker is somebody who takes bets. And it was from interviews with old men who were really in their 80s back in 1987 that I first heard about a gangster called Billy Kimber, who, as you know, was the gangster killed at the end of series 1 of Peaky Blinders. Right. He was a real man. I first heard about the real Derby Sabini. Now, as you know, Derby Sabini was portrayed in the series as a mafia-style don. Nothing like that at all. I interviewed a man called Simeon Solomon, who was the younger brother of the real Alfie Solomon, the Jewish gangster played by Tom Hardy. So back in the early 80s, the mid 80s, the late 80s, I was researching the real Peaky Blinder gangs, and I'd started to research the real gangs of the 1920s. And that was something that I was looking at doing for many years on and off. And then before the series started, I write for the Birmingham Mail, the local newspaper. I write a column on local history. And they asked me, they said, Carl, there's this new series coming out called the Peaky Blinders. Do you know anything about the real Peaky Blinders? I said, yes. And they said, there's a gangster called Billy Kimber. Do you know anything about Billy Kimber? I went, yes. So I wrote articles in the Birmingham Mail before the series came out about the reality. And the reality, Manon, is very important to bear in mind, is different, very different to the glamorous gangsterism shown in the TV series.
Right. Right. So, Professor Carl, what was it that led to this rise of the gang Peaky Blinders?
So, The series is set in Birmingham in the 1920s. That's when it begins, immediately after the First World War. It's based around a family called the Shelbys, one family who live in the Small Heath district around a pub called the Garrison. And they are the focal point of a gang that is led by them called the Peaky Blinders. They are well dressed. They are making big money from protection rackets and illegal betting. And they are organised criminals. The reality of the Peaky Blinders was very different, Manna. The real Peaky Blinders were not around in the 1920s. Okay. The real Peaky Blinders emerged from the backstreet gangs of Birmingham. The first use of the term in the press, locally in Birmingham, was in 1890. There wasn't one gang. There were numerous gangs of Peaky Blinders. There wasn't one family. There were numerous families involved, and they were not major organised criminal gangs. The real Peaky Blinders were backstreet thugs who fought each other, attacked the police, and bullied the people amongst whom they lived. And that, to me, is the worst crime. They bullied the poor amongst whom they lived. And contrary to what's been said by some people associated with the series, that people felt the Peaky Blinders were at least our gangsters, the Peaky Blinders were feared and hated because of their bullying. Okay. So how did they emerge? From the late 1860s, backstreet gangs become prominent in Salford and Manchester, Liverpool and Birmingham, the East End of London, much of North London and much of South London. There are gangs elsewhere in Sheffield and Leeds, but not as bad. Sorry, the problem of gangsterism and backstreet gangstering was not as bad in those cities as in Manchester, Salford, Liverpool, Birmingham and parts of London. What led to the rise of those gangs? In Birmingham, I think there were two big factors. One was what was termed, at the time, I wouldn't use this word now, but at the time it was called a crusade against gambling. On a Sunday afternoon, the day when people in England should have gone to church, young working class men, teenagers and young men, met on waste ground, and they gambled with coins, throwing coins into mark, and whoever got them nearest threw them up in the air. And if they came down heads, they kept them. Or they had very rough games. And the middle class, who were still living in the old areas of Birmingham then, are really angered at this. All these young men on the Lord's Day, when they should be at church, gathering in large numbers, which was frightening, gambling, which was against the law, and engaging in rough sports and swearing. And so they put pressure on the police to put down these gatherings. This is in the late 1860s. Then in 1867, just as the gangs are emerging, there's a massive riot in Birmingham. And there was a horrible man called William Murphy, who was a Protestant who hated Catholics. And he would travel the country and set up a big tent, and he'd hire local hard men to protect him. And he'd set up the tent by an Irish area, and he'd say horrible things about the Pope. That led to a riot in Birmingham where the Irish attacked him and his guards. And the next day there was a massive riot of the English attacking the Irish. The Irish of one street formed a gang to protect themselves. The nearby English also formed gangs. So I think there's two factors coming together. This attack on working class young men gathering on a Sunday, and this huge riot in 1867. And then by the 1870s, the backstreet gang problem in Birmingham has become really, really bad. And the city is becoming notorious. And at first, these gang members are called sluggers, and they're parts of slugging gangs. The word slug is to hit with a fierce blow. From 1890, the term Peaky Blinder comes into use, and the Peaky Blinders were members of slugging gangs.
Okay. And why is it that they call themselves the Peaky Blinders?
Right. The story goes that the Peaky Blinders were named after the disposable safety razor blades stitched into the forehead, into the front of their caps.
Yes,
and
that's what it's shown in the series as well.
Yeah, and they take the caps off and they slash. Now, so this is a flat cap.
Yes.
Right? I'm going to take that cap off. we're going to have a fight. When I do that, what do I do to my body? I lift my arm up. I open my body for the other person to attack me.
Right.
Number two, a flat cap is soft.
Yes.
I take that off. How
Nothing
am I going to hit
happens.
someone?
Yeah.
Okay, so I go to the front. I cut my fingers. So you've got to have it folded if it's going to work. Have I got time in a fight to fold it?
No.
So number one, Manon, it's not feasible. Number two, it never happened. There is absolutely no evidence. I've gone through hundreds and hundreds of police reports, newspaper accounts, well, probably thousands, never mentioned. And finally, disposable safety razor blades were not patented by King Gillette in America till the turn of the 20th century. They were not sold in England in big numbers till 1910, by which time the Peaky Blinders had disappeared.
Okay.
And those razor blades were too expensive anyway for a working man. What working class men, particularly poorer men, did, they went to a barber, not just for a haircut, but for a shave. They couldn't afford razors. So it never happened, Manon. But that was the myth that a lot of Brummies grew up with. And obviously the author, Stephen Knight, had heard that growing up like I did.
Right.
So that leads to another question, if I may.
Yes.
What weapons did they use?
Exactly.
Right, so they used stones. They threw stones at the police, at each other, big stones. There was waste ground around. They would pick up bricks and smash them in half and throw the bricks. 2 policemen were killed by bricks being thrown at them. They would have koshes, you know, like a little metal kosh that they would fight with. They had knives, but their favorite weapon was a belt. So this would be a thick leather belt with a heavy brass buckle. And they would have it, take it off, ready for a fight if they were ready to fight, or have it ready when they knew they were going to have a fight. And they would wrap it round their wrist. And they'd leave a bit, about 10, 12 inches, and they'd catch it in the palm of their hand and hold it. And there's about 8 inches left now, and they would then buckle it, and they would slash and slash and slash. It caused terrible injuries, terrible injuries. So those were their weapons. So there were no Peaky Blinders in the 1920s. They didn't fight with flat caps with disposable safety razor blades. There wasn't just one family. They were not organised criminals. And they were not glamorously dressed. And they weren't just from one district. They were from all over old Birmingham.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because in the series, it's shown that the criminals are quite fancy. They wear a 3-piece suit. They have like, they drive expensive cars. So it was like really, what should I say? A reality check that wasn't the true picture back in the times.
Now, the gangs disappeared before the First World War. How did they disappear and why? Several reasons. And they're coming together, these reasons. They're not planned, they're not coordinated, but they work with each other. So first of all, stronger policing. Now, in the series, the first 2 or 3 series, there's a policeman called Major Campbell.
Yes.
Who's a Protestant from Northern Ireland. In 1899, a Protestant from Northern Ireland was appointed Chief Constable of Birmingham. That was the top policeman. His name was Charles Rafter. But unlike Major Campbell, who hated Catholics in the series, Rafter, his second in command was an Irish Catholic, Michael McManus. So there wasn't that sectarianism. Rafter was appointed in 1899, and the Birmingham police force was undermanned. So he embarked on a rapid recruitment campaign, and his men had to be 5'10", whereas most of the Peaky Blinders were small, 5'4", 5'5". They had to be fit, and the story goes that he asked 3 things of them, of his recruits. Can you read? Can you write? Can you fight? And they took the fight to the Peaky Blinders. In the toughest areas, they went around in 2s because a policeman on his own couldn't cope. But these tough men went into the back streets. There's not a lot of evidence about the fighting with the police, but there's enough.
Mm-hmm.
So number one, strong policing. Number two, stronger sentences. A Peaky Blinder could get sent down for a vicious assault for a month or 2 months, but pay a fine instead. When Rafter came in, he said, any assault on the police must be 6 months. That was the maximum that a magistrate could give in a lower court. But any serious assault had to go to a higher court where they could pass longer sentences. So stronger policing, stronger sentencing. That inspires confidence in poorer people. They start to come forward to give evidence. In the 1870s, there was a big attack on the police, the Navigation Street riot, and a policeman was killed, and a young woman gave evidence against the killer. He was hung. The young woman was knifed by his family. There was intimidation of witnesses. But what happens after Rafter comes in, slowly they gain confidence, the poorer do, in giving evidence. And I've got numerous examples of that. So stronger policing, stronger sentencing, inspiring confidence in poor people to give evidence against Peaky Blinders. Then, at the same time, from the late 1800s, a number of socially concerned clergymen and women involved with churches and chapels are setting up what we would now call youth clubs. And they start football clubs, and football becomes a really popular game, not just to go and watch, but to play. And lads on a Saturday afternoon after they finish work on a Sunday are playing on waste ground. So they're not joining gangs, or else they're going to the church or the chapel and they're joining the youth club. Some vicars are starting rudimentary boxing clubs. That appeals to some of the toughest lads. So sport's important, provision of facilities is important. And just as the gangs are disappearing, a new leisure form comes in. You youngsters would call it the cinema. In my day, it was called the pictures. And the boys are going to the pictures 2 and 3 nights a week, young men. So if they're not playing football or go to a youth club, a church club, they're going to the pictures. If they're doing those, they're not joining the gangs. So by 1910, the rampant backstreet gangsterism of Birmingham, which had bedeviled and blighted the lives of the poor and the police, was over. There were still nasty men, Manon. There were still small gangs, but the rampant ruffianism and backstreet gangsterism had gone. And what happened to those Peaky Blinders? Well, there were the younger ones of them. Most of them went and fought in the First World War and were killed or wounded. Others went and worked in the munitions factories. So there were no Peaky Blinders as such in the 1920s. There were men who had been Peaky Blinders. They were no longer in gangs. And they were no longer Peaky Blinders.
Wow. Okay. So this is another reality check, that because in the series, it's been shown that the Peaky Blinders extended until the Second World War, until Oswald Mosley came in. And that's all.
It's
for the cinema purpose.
Drama. Drama. Like Winston Churchill being involved. Oswald Mosley being involved. These gangsters were backstreet men. Now, what happens in the 20s is a little bit more similar to the series. Some of the most vicious and vile Peaky Blinders from the late 1800s used to go to race courses in groups of 6, 7, and 8, little gangs. Why are they going to race courses? Well, the railway system is extended, so it means they can travel. And if you're going to a race course, you want to bet, don't you? So what are you carrying, Manon? If you're going to have a bet,
cash,
money. What have the bookmakers got? Money. So they start to pickpocket and intimidate the bookmakers for protection money. Before the First World War, a loose collection of these gangs from Birmingham, known as the Brummagem Boys, were brought together in a slightly better organised fashion by the real Billy Kimber. Now, in the series, do you remember Billy Kimber was shown as in charge of the race courses?
Yes,
but he was a Londoner. Yeah, do you remember he was a Londoner?
Yeah.
He wasn't a Londoner. He was a big Brummie. He was from Birmingham.
Oh, okay.
descendants of friends of mine. They've been in touch with me over the last 10, 15 years.
Who has been in touch with you?
The descendants of Billy Kimber.
Oh,
His great-granddaughter, great-grandson, and great-great-grandsons. Billy Kimber was England's first major organised gang leader. It wasn't as organised as the Mafia or the 'Ndrangheta of Calabria or the Camorra or the Yakuza or any of these gangs. But he brought this collection of rogues from Birmingham, a little gang of 8, another one of 6, together into a big force. So they could take anybody on if they needed to. And by the First World War, they controlled the blackmailing of bookmakers and the pickpocketing on the racecourses of the Midlands and the north of England. Now, the First World War comes, racing mostly ends. But after the First World War, it starts and it booms because immediately after the First World War, there's all this pent-up emotion. People haven't been going to football matches. They haven't been going to the races. A lot of the ex-army and navy men have got money from the army and navy. They've got to go and spend it. And in the south of England, various gangs are fighting for control. What happens is in 1920, the Birmingham gang, as it's now called, led by Billy Kimber, allies with 2 London gangs. George Sage from Camden Town and the McDonalds from South London, the Elephant Boys. And they take over the rackets down south. Kimber's moved to London by now because there's more money down there. There's more race courses. What happens is, though, Manon, is that the Birmingham gang and their London allies, the Elephant Boys and the North Londoners, are anti-Semitic and racist. A lot of bookmakers in the south of England from London were Jewish from the East End. And the gang, the Birmingham gang and their allies, extorted extra money from them. And in March 1921, a bookmaker called Alfie Solomon was viciously beaten up by the Birmingham gang. That makes him a gangster. He turns to a powerful figure in the Jewish East End underworld who thinks, I can now take over the gang, the rackets in the south of England. Alfie Solomon joins this gang of Jewish hard men, tough men. And their leader, a man called Edward Emanuel, who I've written a lot about, calls in as an ally an Anglo-Italian gang led by Darby Sabini. So remember Sabini from the series?
yes.
Now in the series, Sabini is portrayed as a mafia-style don, elegantly dressed, speaking English with an Italian accent. Darby Sabini, Darby was his nickname. His real name was Octavio. He wasn't Italian, he was English. His dad was Italian, but his mother was an English woman. And his dad had come over to England as a young boy. And he didn't speak Italian. He spoke with a London accent.
Oh.
But he had a gang, including his brother Joe and Harry, and other Anglo-Italians, and some men who were of only English heritage. They joined up with the Jewish gang, and they fought with the Birmingham gang and their allies to control the racecourses in the south of England. And that led to England's first major gang war between gangs from different cities. The Birmingham gang fighting the Sabini gang, which was this gang of the Anglo-Jewish, Anglo-Italians and Englishmen. Suffice it to say that eventually the Sabini gang gained control of the rackets down south. The Birmingham gang retreated to the Midlands and the north. Kimber stayed in London. Another gang war erupted in 1922. But this was the beginning of organised crime in England. And the London gangs based themselves on, the succeeding London gangs based themselves on the Sabini gang. By contrast, Manon, the Birmingham gang disappears. This is the country's first major gang. It disappears for a number of reasons. Firstly, strong policing in Birmingham. Secondly, there's no nightclubs in Birmingham. The Sabini gang is eventually pushed from the racecourses in the south of England, that they move into Soho, nightclubs, drinking dens, and they extort protection money from the nightclub owners and the drinking den owners. And they also extort protection money from restaurateurs, publicans. In Birmingham, there's no nightclubs. There's no racecourses. There was one on the outskirts of Birmingham. So there's no opportunity for organised crime in Birmingham. There's strong police force. Their leader, Billy Kimber, is living in London. Their other leaders disappear, either move to London or are imprisoned or die. So by the late 20s and certainly by the early 30s, there's no such thing as anymore as the Birmingham gang. There's a number of nasty men with little gangs in Birmingham, but they're petty criminals. So there's nothing like a Shelby gang in Birmingham in the 1920s or 30s. Nothing at all.
Wow. So that's really interesting. Now, how many of the characters that have been shown in the series are actually true? Obviously, you have mentioned Alfie Solomon and Billy Kimber, but apart from that, yeah, and Sabini, was Thomas Shelby a real character, or was any other characters that are shown in the series were real?
Stephen Knight, the author, has said that the idea for the Peaky Blinders came from a story that his dad had heard told to him by his dad's maternal uncles about the Peaky Blinders and a family called the Sheldons, who they were related to. I've done a lot of research on the Sheldons. They were a nasty family. The Sheldons, 3 of the brothers out of 5 were Peaky Blinders. They were petty criminals, and they had a gang around them. And between 1908 and 12, just as the Peaky Blinders were disappearing, there was a vicious gang war in Birmingham between the Sheldons and their gang and a man called Billy Beach and his friends. And this gang warfare was between men in their 40s and 50s and 30s, and it was known as the last of the Peaky Blinders. The Sheldons were sent down for long terms of imprisonment for various offences, and by the 1920s, they were elderly men. So there was a family called the Sheldons that the idea of the Shelbys led to, but they were not big style glamorous gangsters. They were notorious in Birmingham. They were burglars. They made false coins. They were probably the worst criminals in Birmingham at the time, but they were not a major organised gang like the Shelbys. They didn't have a lot of money in the end. They lost the money. They spent it. They lived in poor quality houses. They were not fashionably dressed. There's a photo of Samuel Sheldon in my first book. So the Sheldons were perhaps a kind of idea that led to the Shelbys. I think Thomas Shelby probably has got a bit more in common with the real Billy Kimber, if anyone. But overall, there's no real Thomas Shelby. There's no Shelby family. And the other real characters I've mentioned would be Darby Sabini, Alfie Solomon, Billy Kimber, obviously. Those are the 3 main gangsters of the early 1920s.
And how are you related to the Peaky Blinders?
My great-grandfather, my father's grandfather on his mother's side, was a real Peaky Blinder. His name was Edward Derrick. I knew of him growing up. I knew he was a violent man. I knew he'd been arrested for petty theft. I knew he used to beat up my great-grandmother, and he was a disliked man, very disliked. And then years later, well before the series, I found a photograph in the West Midlands Police Museum of him. And he was dressed like a Peaky Blinder with the flat cap and what was called a daff, which was like a scarf, not silk, because that's too expensive, but a soft, not woolen, more of a thin material, wrapped around the neck and knotted at the front. And the daff was their favourite neck gear. And he had his hair parted in the fashion of the later Peaky Blinders. The early Peaky Blinders had close-cropped hair with a quiff. But my real great-grandfather was a horrible, nasty man. He was imprisoned for violence. On one occasion, he attacked a man and got a big meat chopper and chopped it into his head. The man lived, hence he wasn't hanged. He beat up my great-grandmother viciously. He attacked the police, and he was a petty criminal. So that leads to a question, really, man. Why were they called Peaky Blinders if it wasn't for the razor blades?
Yes, exactly.
And that goes back to the fashion. Some of them, not all, because most of them were poor men. In fact, they were all poor. But some of them liked trousers that were called bell bottoms. So bell bottoms were tight trousers to the knee. Then they went wide.
Right. After the knee. Yeah.
Yeah. So they wore, their fashion was to wear bell bottom trousers. They would wear a smart jacket if possible, but most of them were too poor to afford. So they'd wear any kind of jacket. And when I say a smart jacket, it would be like a suit jacket, but a second-hand one. Not because poor people couldn't afford new clothes. They would have the daff round the neck. And the first Peaky Blinders did not wear a flat cap. They wore what was called a billycock. And a billycock was like a bowler hat. They had short hair, but they liked to quiff. Bit of hair coming down here. So to show that off, which was a fashion statement, they used to pull the hat over one eye to show off the quiff on that eye. Hence, the brow, the beam, the brow of the billycock, the peak, covered the eye. When the flat cap became the fashion in the later 1890s, the same thing happened. They pulled the flat cap over one eye to about there. So the peak was blind in one eye. I've got lots of photos showing Peaky Blinders with billycocks, bowler hats, and later on with quiffs and short haircuts. It was a fashion. It was nothing to do with weapons.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Another question would be, was drinking and smoking as prominent as that is shown in the show?
Yes, yeah. Drinking and smoking was lots and lots of men and women smoked in the 20s and 30s. And not all men, not all women, but it was very popular, and so was drinking, but not the spirits. It was much more beer.
Okay.
And there was no drug taking, not like you see in the series. There was drug taking in London, in Soho, in some of the more affluent clubs where rich people went, but the gangs didn't take drugs, and working class people didn't take drugs.
Got it. And another question would be, in the series, Aunt Polly has been shown to be a very strong female character throughout the series. So what was the position of women back then in those periods? Were women also involved in this type of gang wars?
Women were not involved in the gangs of the 20s. There were lots of strong women. My grandmothers were all strong women, and my great-grandmothers were strong women. They were fighting poverty, man. It was hard. The battle, you know, any country, women are in the forefront of the battle against poverty to fight to stay clean. Darby Sabini's wife was never involved in the gangs. In fact, she persuaded him to move away from the gangs to live on the south coast of England so that their son and daughters could be brought up middle class. Billy Kimber's 2 daughters in Birmingham and his wife in Birmingham, he abandoned them. They were not involved in the gangs. When his first wife in Birmingham died in poverty, he married another woman. They moved to the south coast. He became a legitimate bookmaker, and his wife became middle class, and his 2 daughters were brought up very wealthy. Alfie Solomon didn't marry. So there's no evidence at all of any wives or aunts or sisters being involved in the major gangs of the 20s and 30s. There is some evidence of the real Peaky Blinders in the 1890s, the sloggers before them, of their girlfriends joining in gang fights, picking up bricks and stones to give them. There is some evidence of some fighting by some young women, but the idea that there were strong women like Aunt Polly who were leading organised criminal gangs, no, I have never come across any. in all my research, which is very detailed and long-standing. But there were strong women.
Indeed. And Professor Carl, what else would you like to point out that is shown in the series is not true, but but the reality is something else which we might be missing out here?
Well, I think as the series has gone on, it's moved away from Birmingham. The idea of the gangs joining up with gangs in Glasgow, with Oswald Mosley's involvement, with Winston Churchill's involvement, all of those didn't happen. Now, do you remember, was it series 4 when a man called Luca Changretta came over from New York to avenge the deaths of his father and brother? Right, now, Changretta is an unusual Italian name. I am friends with the descendants of the real Changrettas. Okay. I'm an Aston Villa supporter. I'm going down to see the Villa play tonight, and I will be sitting by the descendants of the Changrettas. The Changrettas were not a criminal family. They were a decent, hard-working, law-abiding family. Martino Changretta came over from a poor part of Italy in the late 19th century. He was really an indentured worker. He was brought over by a better off Italian from his village and made to walk the streets selling ice cream, etc. Eventually, he paid off what he owed the Italian from his village, and he married an English woman, Amy Kitchen. They had a big family. He became a British citizen. He fought in the Second South African War. He became a demolition worker and a foreman, and he was responsible for the clearance of the site where Birmingham's Hall of Memory, which honours the fallen of 2 wars, was built. One of the names, there's a book of remembrance in there. One of the names in it is his oldest son, who was killed fighting for Britain at the end of the First World War. His only remaining son was killed towards the end of the Second World War when he was in a regiment that landed in Italy to fight the Nazis. He had one son left, and he died perhaps 100 miles from where his dad had left in the late 1800s. So I'm very keen to get across to as many people as possible that the Changrettas of Birmingham were not criminals. They were honourable, they were decent, and they were respectable citizens.
Right. And now that you're pointing out so many contradictions between the real story and the series, was there any situation where the descendant of these families that are involved that are shown in the series even had a chance to write to Stephen Knight or to BBC saying that all this which is being shown in the series is not true about us?
I wouldn't know about that because I have no connections with the production company or the BBC in that sense. However, they contacted me, the descendants of the Changrettas, the descendants of Billy Kimber from Birmingham, contacted me because they wanted the reality to be shown, and they knew that I would do that. Okay. Alfie Solomon has no descendants, and Sabini has no direct descendants on the male line. His son was killed in the Second World War, but people who were connected to Sabini were in touch with me many years ago. So my research and my writings, Manon, are from a number of major sources. One, speaking to people that lived at the time, and that goes back to my work in the 1980s. 2, research at the West Midlands Police Museum. 3, research at newspapers. 4, research at the National Archives. 5, people writing to me with memories. So it's wide-ranging and it's detailed. So the series is, enjoy the series, but remember, it's drama. The reality was very different. And the reality is this: gangsters are not meant to be admired. Whether they're backstreet thugs or organised gangsters, they are not meant to be admired.
So thank you, Professor Carl, for your time. I think this has been intriguing for me to know. And I think we'll do some other episodes as well with you to know more about it in detail. But thank you for doing this.
Thank you.